Hey, tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating yet terrifying periods, the Egyptian Dark Age. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Egypt around 2180 BCE. The magnificent old kingdom, with its towering pyramids and powerful pharaohs, has fallen into disarray. You've arrived at the beginning of what scholars would later call the First Intermediate Period, a time of chaos, starvation, and a complete breakdown of the centralized power that once made Egypt the greatest civilization on Earth. The good news? The breathtaking pyramids of Giza still stand in all their glory, silent witnesses to a golden age that just slipped away. The bad news? You're about to discover why most people, including you, wouldn't survive what's coming next. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and step outside your mud brick home on this fateful morning, something immediately feels different. The air hangs heavy with tension, and people scurry through the narrow streets with worried expressions. Rumours swirl through the village like windblown sand. The mighty Pharaoh Pepi II has died after an incredibly long reign of possibly 90 years, and the central government is crumbling faster than stale bread. You've awakened in a land that's about to be torn apart by power struggles, environmental catastrophe, and the complete dissolution of the social order that held Egyptian civilization together for over 500 years. They say the Nile hasn't flooded properly for 3 years now, whispers a woman carrying a clay jar of water. The royal granaries are almost empty. In ancient Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile River was everything. It wasn't just important, it was life itself. The floodwaters would spill over the riverbanks, depositing a layer of rich, dark silt that made the surrounding fields incredibly fertile. Without this yearly miracle, crops failed and people starved, and unfortunately for you, you've arrived at exactly the moment when this reliable cycle has become devastatingly unpredictable. The sacred connection between Pharaoh and the gods appears to be broken, and the consequences are dire. For as long as anyone can remember, the Egyptian people believed their king maintained Mawat, the cosmic order and balance of the universe. The pharaoh was quite literally responsible for making sure the sun rose each morning and the Nile flooded each year. Now, with weak leadership and succession problems following the death of Pepi II, the natural order appears to be collapsing. As you walk toward the village centre, your empty stomach reminds you that breakfast today will be meagre, perhaps just a small piece of bread if you're lucky. Food is becoming scarce as fields lie parched and cracked under the merciless sun. What was once the breadbasket of the ancient world is slowly transforming into a land where hunger rules. Did you hear what happened in the village across the river? A thin man asks another as they pass by. They say people there are eating their own children. Your blood runs cold at these words. Surely this must be an exaggeration, a macabre rumour born of fear. But as the days pass, you'll discover the horrible truth. The famine gripping Egypt is pushing people to unimaginable extremes. In your former life, you might have read about this time period in history books or seen documentaries about ancient Egypt that glossed over the darker aspects. But living it is something else entirely. The smell of fear and desperation hangs in the air, mixing with the dust and the scent of the drying Nile. This is no longer the mighty Egypt of legend. This is a civilization fighting for its very survival. As you continue walking, you notice something else. The local temple, once immaculately maintained, shows signs of neglect. Without strong central authority, resources for religious observances have dwindled. The priests appear thinner, their once pristine white linen robes now dull and worn. The sacred rituals that were believed to maintain cosmic harmony are being performed less frequently or with less care. You've stepped into a world where the divine order that governed everything is unraveling thread by thread. In the distance, you spot a group of men arguing heatedly. They're discussing the rise of the local governor, or nomarch as Egyptians call them. With the central government weakening, these provincial leaders are claiming more power for themselves. Some are even declaring independence from Memphis, the traditional capital. Antifi is the only one who can protect us now, says one man firmly. He's promised grain to anyone who pledges loyalty to him instead of the so-called king. This is another crucial aspect of the Dark Age you found yourself in. Egypt is fragmenting into smaller territories controlled by ambitious local leaders. These nomarchs were once appointed by the pharaoh, but now they're becoming hereditary rulers in their own right, passing power to their sons and creating dynasties that owe no allegiance to a central authority. Some, like Antifi of Hieraconpolis, will even start referring to themselves in the same grandiose terms once reserved for pharaohs. The collapse of centralized power means that Egypt, once united under the divine pharaoh, is now a patchwork of competing territories, and you, unfortunately, are caught in the middle of this dangerous political fragmentation. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, beating down mercilessly, you notice groups of men with simple weapons, wooden clubs, farming tools transformed for fighting, and if they're fortunate, perhaps a copper dagger or two. They gather at the edge of the village, nervously watching the horizon. The breakdown in centralized authority hasn't just affected the food supply and religious practices, it's also made Egypt much more dangerous. The neighbouring gnome raided the village downriver last night, explains an older man when he notices your questioning gaze. Took what little grain they had stored. We fear we might be next. Without the pharaoh's army maintaining peace throughout the land, village is turning against village, gnome against gnome, as people grow increasingly desperate for resources. The once stable society is dissolving into conflict and banditry. Survival now depends not just on having enough food and water, but on being able to defend what little you have from those who would take it by force. By midday, you've gathered enough information to understand just how precarious your situation is. The Egypt you found yourself in is experiencing simultaneous crises on multiple fronts. Environmental disaster, the Nile's floods have become unpredictable, leading to crop failures and widespread famine. Political collapse. With the end of the Old Kingdom, centralized authority has disintegrated and local governors are seizing power. Social breakdown. The shared beliefs and practices that once united Egyptian society are weakening, leading to conflict between communities. Religious uncertainty. As the pharaoh's divine connection appears broken, people are turning to magic and local deities for protection. As the reality of your situation sinks in, you realize that surviving in this dark age will require resources, connections, and skills that you don't yet possess. The comfortable, ordered Egypt of the Old Kingdom, with its magnificent monuments and well-regulated society, is gone. In its place is a land of uncertainty and danger where each day brings new challenges to survival. You decide your best chance is to seek employment with one of the local families that still has resources, perhaps as a field worker if you have a strong back, or as a household servant if you have other skills to offer. Having a patron in these dangerous times might mean the difference between life and death. As you approach a larger dwelling near the centre of the village, you notice something that gives you pause. Small clay figurines with human features placed near the entrance. These crude objects are a sign of how Egyptians are turning to magic for protection in these uncertain times. During the First Intermediate Period, personal magic and superstition became much more prominent as people sought ways to control their increasingly chaotic world. "Don't touch those," warns a woman who notices your interest. there for protection against evil spirits and enemies. The mistress had them made by the wise woman at the edge of the village. These figurines, are sometimes inscribed with the names of enemies or threats, then ritually destroyed to neutralize the danger through sympathetic magic. As the state religion loses some of its hold, these personal magical practices are becoming more common. People are taking spiritual matters into their own hands, rather than relying solely on the elaborate temple rituals of the past. You're invited inside the house, where the owner, a local merchant who trades what little surplus the village produces, questions you about your skills and background. As you speak, a commotion outside draws everyone's attention. A group of men has arrived, dusty from travel, bearing news. The nomarch of Thebes is gathering an army, announces their leader. He claims he will reunite the two lands and restore Mayat. He's calling for all able men to join him. This is your first encounter with the forces that will eventually end the Dark Age. The nomarchs of Thebes, particularly those named Intef and later Mentuhotep, will gradually extend their control, fighting against rival powers until Egypt is once again unified under a single ruler. But that process will take decades and involve considerable bloodshed and suffering. For now, the announcement causes debate among the villagers. Some see the Theban nomarch as a potential saviour who might restore order and prosperity. Others fear being drawn into conflicts that don't concern them, preferring to focus on immediate survival. Better to stay here and guard what little we have, argues one man. These power-hungry nomarchs care nothing for common people like us. As the debate continues, you notice a small group of people preparing to leave the village entirely. They're gathering meagre possessions and speaking in hushed tones. "We're heading north," explains one when you inquire. "My cousin says there's still food in the delta, where the river splits into many branches. The nomarch there is strong and keeps order." This migration is another feature of the first intermediate period, people moving in search of safety and sustenance, sometimes abandoning ancestral villages that had been occupied for generations. The population is shifting as Egyptians seek places where they might survive the overlapping crises. As evening approaches, you're offered a place to sleep in the merchant's household in exchange for help with various tasks. You've secured temporary shelter, but your future remains deeply uncertain. The merchant explains that his own stores are dwindling, and he may not be able to support extra mouths for long. That night, as you lie on a simple reed mat in the corner of a storage room, you listen to the sounds of a village on edge. Dogs bark at real or imagined threats. Hushed conversations continue late into the night, and occasionally you hear the distant wail of someone mourning a loss, perhaps another victim of hunger or violence. This is your new reality. You've awakened in ancient Egypt's darkest hour, when all the structures and beliefs that made it great are being tested to their limits. But humans are nothing if not adaptable, and tomorrow you'll begin learning the skills and making the connections that might allow you to survive. As you drift towards sleep, your last thought is of the pyramids standing silently in the distance, monuments to a golden age that now seems as remote as the stars. Egypt has fallen before, but it will rise again. The question is whether you'll live to see its rebirth. The whispers of the village fade as exhaustion finally overtakes your worried mind. Tomorrow will bring new challenges in this harsh new world you must navigate. For now, sleep offers temporary escape from the reality of Egypt's Dark Age, a time when the very foundations of one of history's greatest civilizations seemed to crumble like sand through desperate fingers. You're just about to surrender to sleep when you hear a sound that makes your blood freeze. Distant shouts, the barking of dogs growing more frantic, and what might be the glow of torches on the horizon. It seems the fears of a raid were well founded, and your first night in ancient Egypt's Dark Age might prove even more dangerous than you imagined. Tomorrow, if you survive the night, you'll need to learn quickly how to navigate this shattered world. The powerful structures of pharaonic authority that once maintained order have crumbled, and in their place are rising new local powers, the nomarchs, who rule through a combination of military might, control of dwindling resources, and claims to religious authority. For now, though, the immediate threat demands attention. The merchant's household stirs as the alarm spreads through the village. Men grab improvised weapons while women gather children and valuables. You'll soon face your first test in this brutal new reality. The once mighty Egypt that built the pyramids and conquered neighbouring lands is now a place where villages raid each other for food and where survival depends on one's wit, strength, and luck. The old Egyptian prayer to the gods takes on new urgency in your mind. May you grant me life, prosperity, and health. In the dark age you've awakened to, none of these can be taken for granted. Sleep will have to wait. The Egyptian Dark Age waits for no one, and your journey of survival has only just begun. The raid approaching your village is just the first of many challenges you'll face in this broken land if you manage to survive the night. The warning cries grow louder as you scramble to your feet, heart pounding in your chest. The merchant's household erupts into frantic activity, children crying, women gathering essential belongings, men rushing to defend their homes. Outside, the night sky glows orange with approaching torches. "They're coming from the east," shouts a man at the doorway. "At least 20 of them." The merchant, whose name you've learned is Senbi, thrusts a wooden staff into your hands. "Can you fight?" he asks, his eyes betraying his own fear. Before you can answer, a horn sounds from the village centre, 3 long, mournful notes that seem to hang in the air. It's a signal of some kind, and immediately the chaotic movements of the villagers become more purposeful. They've faced this threat before, you realise. This is not the first raid they've endured in these difficult times. "Follow me," Senbi commands. "We're going to the headman's compound. It's the strongest building in the village." As you hurry through the darkened streets, clutching your improvised weapon, you see families streaming toward the same destination, a larger mud brick structure with walls substantially thicker than the surrounding homes. In better times, it would have served as the administrative centre where the village headman collected taxes for the distant pharaoh. Now it's become a fortress of last resort. Once inside, you witness an impressive display of community organisation. Despite the fear evident on every face, people move with purpose. Men take positions along the walls, armed with whatever implements they could grab. Farming tools, wooden clubs, a few precious metal spears. Women organise the children in the central courtyard, some preparing bandages from strips of linen, others readying water jars. The village headman, an older man named Ipua with deep lines etched into his face, stands on a raised platform issuing directions. He looks like he's aged decades in just a few years. "Remember, we have little worth stealing," he tells the assembled villagers, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "They want our grain stores. Protect the storage rooms at all costs. Without that grain, we won't survive until the next harvest, if there even is one." A younger man rushes to Ipua's side, whispering urgently in his ear. The headman's face darkens further. "I've just received word," he announces. "These aren't raiders from the neighbouring nome as we feared. These are deserters from the royal army, or what's left of it." This news sends a ripple of even greater fear through the assembled villagers. The royal army, once the pharaoh's disciplined force that maintained order throughout Egypt, has begun to disintegrate without strong central leadership. Groups of soldiers, no longer paid or provisioned, have turned to banditry, and these men are trained fighters, far more dangerous than desperate farmers from a nearby village. "They'll have bronze weapons," someone says, voice quavering. Bronze, you know, is far superior to the copper or stone tools that most common Egyptians possess. During the Old Kingdom, bronze was reserved primarily for the royal army and elites. In the chaos of the First Intermediate period, some of these valuable metal weapons have fallen into the hands of those who use them for their own gain. The sound of shouting draws closer. Through gaps in the compound walls, you can see the torches moving steadily toward the village centre. The former soldiers advance with a discipline that confirms the headman's information. These are not disorganised raiders, but trained fighting men. "Listen carefully," Ipua says, lowering his voice so that people lean in to hear him. "We have something they don't know about. During the last good harvest, I instructed that some of our grain be hidden in the old tomb on the western ridge. If they take what's in our visible storerooms, they may leave without searching further. This strategic thinking impresses you. The headman has anticipated such attacks and prepared accordingly. Perhaps people in this dark age are more resilient and adaptable than you initially gave them credit for." As the shouting outside grows louder, punctuated by the frightened screams of villagers who didn't make it to the compound, Ipua continues with his instructions. "No heroes," he says firmly. "We offer resistance only if they try to enter the compound. Otherwise, let them take what they can find in the outer storehouses. Our priority is survival, not pride." These words reveal how much has changed in Egypt. Once, villages like this would have been protected by the might of the pharaoh's army and the complex administrative system that maintained order throughout the two lands. Now each community must fend for itself, making difficult compromises to survive. Tense minutes pass as you and the others wait in fearful silence. The sounds outside grow louder, shouting, the splintering of wood as doors are broken open, occasional screams. Then comes a pounding on the compound gate. "Open in the name of Pharaoh Neferkar," a voice commands. A bitter laugh escapes from Ipua's throat. "Which one?" he mutters under his breath. This seemingly simple question contains volumes about the political reality of Egypt during the First Intermediate period. After the death of Pepi II, a succession of weak rulers, all claiming the name Neferkare, had briefly occupied the throne. The 7th and 8th dynasties saw rapid turnover, with some kings ruling for mere months or even weeks. Now, various local powers all claim legitimacy through different puppet kings, using the pharaoh's name to justify their actions while wielding the real power themselves. The pounding on the gate grows more insistent. "Open, or we burn the compound with everyone inside." Ipua gives a subtle nod to two men standing by the gate. Slowly, reluctantly, they lift the wooden bar and pull the gates open just wide enough for a single person to enter. A man steps through, tall, with the muscular build of a trained soldier. He wears a tattered military kilt that might once have been impressive, but now shows the wear of hard travel. Most notably, he carries a bronze-tipped spear, its metal point catching the torchlight with a deadly gleam. "I am Sekhem Kare, once captain in the Royal Guard at Memphis," he announces. His voice carries the authority of someone accustomed to command. "My men and I require provisions for our journey northward." Ipua steps forward, showing remarkable courage. "We are a poor village with barely enough to feed ourselves," he says. "The floods have been low these past seasons." Sekhem Kara's lip curls in a sneer. "The same story everywhere, yet somehow you all continue to live?" He gestures, and more of his men pour through the gate, weapons ready. "Show us your storehouses." What happens next unfolds with a grim inevitability. The villagers, outnumbered and outarmed, can only watch as the soldiers locate the grain storage rooms and begin emptying them systematically. They work with military efficiency, loading sacks onto donkeys brought from elsewhere in the village. Standing in the shadows, you observe the faces of the villagers, a mixture of fear, resignation, and carefully hidden anger. This, you realise, is how people survive in such times, by bending rather than breaking, by sacrificing some resources to preserve others, by living to fight another day. As the soldiers work, Sekemkare paces the compound, his eyes taking in every detail. He stops before a small shrine in one corner, a humble structure dedicated to Hapi, the god of the Nile Flood. "Your offerings are meagre," he observes, gesturing to the tiny bread loaves and small beer jar placed before the god's image. "As you said, these are difficult times," Ipua responds carefully. The soldier laughs, a sound without humour. "The gods have abandoned Egypt, old man. They proved useless when the floods failed and Memphis fell into chaos. Better to rely on bronze and strength than divine favour." This exchange illustrates another profound change in Egyptian society during the First Intermediate Period. The elaborate state religion that had unified the country under the divine pharaoh was weakening its hold. While people still practiced religious rituals, there was a growing disillusionment and a turn toward more practical concerns. Some Egyptians, like these soldiers, had lost faith entirely. Others turned to local gods or magical practices that seemed to offer more immediate protection than the distant cosmic deities. The looting continues for several hours. You remain pressed against the wall, trying to make yourself invisible. Occasionally, you exchange glances with Senbi, whose home you had barely settled into before this crisis erupted. His face is a mask of controlled anger, but he makes no move to resist. He understands the calculus of survival in these dangerous times. Finally, when the visible grain stores have been emptied, Sekemkare gives the order to depart. "Be grateful we leave you your lives," he tells Ipua. "Others have not been so fortunate." As the soldiers withdraw, taking their plunder with them, a terrible silence falls over the compound. The immediate danger has passed, but the consequences of the raid will be severe. With winter approaching and much of their stored food now gone, the village faces starvation unless they can find another source of sustenance. Ipua waits until he's certain the soldiers have truly departed before addressing the gathered villagers. "We still have the hidden stores," he reminds them, though his voice lacks conviction. "We'll need to ration strictly until we can determine if the Nile will flood properly this season." An older woman steps forward, her face etched with grief. "My grandson was killed trying to protect our home," she says, her voice breaking. "How many more must we lose before someone restores Mayat to the two lands?" There's that concept again. Mayat, the fundamental Egyptian principle of cosmic order, justice, and harmony. For thousands of years, Egyptians believed that the pharaoh, as intermediary between gods and humans, maintained Mayat through proper rule and religious observance. Now, with weak leadership and natural disasters, Maat seems broken, and Egyptian society along with it. "I've heard the nomarch of Hieraconpolis is gathering strength," offers a man near the back of the crowd. "They say he's a strong leader, one who might restore order." "No," counters another. "Our hope lies with Thebes. The descendants of Intef are the true power in Upper Egypt now." This debate reflects the political reality of the First Intermediate Period. With central authority collapsed, Egypt had essentially split into two competing power centres: Hieraconpolis in the north, Lower Egypt, and Thebes in the south, Upper Egypt. Both claimed legitimacy, and both sought to extend their control over the fractured country. Eventually, the Theban kings would prevail, reunifying Egypt and establishing the Middle Kingdom. But that resolution lay years in the future. As the villagers continue their debate, Senbi touches your arm and gestures toward his house. "Come," he says quietly. "There's nothing more to be done here tonight." Walking back through the village in the pre-dawn light, you witness the aftermath of the raid. Broken doors, scattered possessions, a few small fires still smouldering. Most disturbing are the still forms lying in the dust, villagers who resisted or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back at Senbi's house, you find the structure largely intact. The soldiers had broken in and taken some items of value, but having focused primarily on food stores, they hadn't been thorough in their looting of individual dwellings. "We were fortunate," Senbi says, though his expression suggests he doesn't feel particularly lucky. "My brother in the village downriver lost everything last month. His home burned, his eldest son killed. As the merchant inspects the damage to his property, you help his wife, Henutson, gather scattered belongings. She works methodically, her movements betraying no panic or despair, only a weary determination that speaks of having endured similar hardships before. We still have grain hidden beneath the sleeping mats," she tells you quietly, "and dried fish wrapped in linen inside the pottery vessel for Hathor. The soldiers never think to look in sacred objects." This practical adaptation to crisis impresses you. Throughout Egypt, ordinary people are finding ways to survive the collapse of the social and political systems they once relied upon. They're becoming more self-sufficient, more resourceful, and in some cases, more ruthless. As the household slowly returns to order, Senbi makes a decision. "I'm going to speak with the village council," he announces. "We cannot simply wait for the next raid. We must seek protection." "From whom?" Henutson asks. "The nomarch of this province hasn't sent his men to collect taxes in 2 floods. I doubt he'll send them to protect us." "Or not our nomarch," Senbi says. "I've heard that Antifi of Hieraconpolis is extending his influence. They say he protects the villages that acknowledge his authority and that he has grain to distribute when needed. The name Antifi catches your attention. From your knowledge of this period, you recognize him as one of the most significant figures of the early First Intermediate period, a nomarch who controlled several provinces and left behind an elaborate tomb with inscriptions boasting of his power and generosity during times of famine. An outsider, Henutson sounds skeptical. Can we trust him?" "We trusted the pharaoh and his officials," Senbi replies bitterly. "Where are they now? At least Antifi has real power in this region. They say he defeated the nomarch of Edfu and now controls both territories." This conversation reveals how loyalty in Egypt has become more pragmatic and localized. For millennia, Egyptians had viewed the pharaoh as a divine figure who united the 2 lands and maintained cosmic order. Now, with that central authority shattered, people are transferring their allegiance to whoever can provide immediate protection and resources. Local strongmen like Antifi who combine military might with claims of benevolence toward those under their control. By mid-morning, the village is beginning to recover from the night's trauma. Bodies of the dead are prepared for simple burials. The elaborate funerary practices of more prosperous times are no longer possible for most Egyptians. Damage is assessed, remaining food stores inventoried and secured. Life continues, albeit more precariously than before. You help Senbi repair the damaged door to his storeroom, working with mud brick and wooden supports. As you labour, he explains more about the region's political situation. 3 years ago, we still received officials from Memphis, he tells you. They collected taxes in the pharaoh's name and registered the height of the Nile Flood. There was order, even if the harvests were becoming less bountiful. Then the messengers stopped coming. We heard rumours of fighting in the capital, of rival claimants to the throne. He pauses, wiping sweat from his brow despite the relatively cool morning air. Some villagers continued sending tribute northward, hoping to maintain the old ways. Others kept their grain and goods for themselves. Without the royal army to enforce collection, the entire system fell apart. This explanation captures the administrative collapse that accompanied the political fragmentation of Egypt. The Old Kingdom had functioned through an elaborate bureaucracy that collected taxes, organized labor for monumental projects, and redistributed resources throughout the country. When that system broke down, communities were left to fend for themselves or seek protection from local powers. By midday, a village assembly has been called. You accompany Senbi to the meeting, curious to observe how governance functions in this time of crisis. About 30 adults gather in the shadow of the headman's compound, their faces showing the strain of recent events, but also a determined resilience. Ipua calls the gathering to order. We need to make difficult decisions, he begins without preamble. Our visible grain stores are gone. The hidden reserves will last perhaps 2 months with strict rationing. We must find a way to survive until the next harvest, if the Nile blesses us with a proper flood this year. The discussion that follows reveals the desperate calculations of people in crisis. Some advocate sending representatives to neighbouring villages to barter valuable goods for food. Others suggest a fishing expedition to the distant lake, though this would mean travelling through potentially dangerous territory. A few voices call for seeking help from the nomarch of Thebes, whose influence is gradually extending northward. Senbi waits until most have spoken before rising to his feet. I have traded with villages under Antifi's protection, he says. They suffer less than most. He has organised the construction of irrigation works to make better use of what little water the Nile provides. And his soldiers keep bandits at bay. This information sparks intense debate. Antifi controls territories to the south, and acknowledging his authority would mean shifting allegiance away from traditional power centres. Some see this as pragmatic, others as a betrayal of proper order. Will he demand tribute? Someone asks. Of course, Senbi replies, but better to give grain willingly to a protector than have it stolen by bandits, and they say he redistributes food in times of greatest need. The debate continues as the afternoon wears on. You listen, fascinated by this glimpse into governance during a time of collapse. There are no easy answers, no perfect solutions, only difficult choices with uncertain outcomes. Finally, Ipua calls for a decision. We will send a delegation to Antifi, he announces. 3 respected members of our community will travel to Hieraconpolis and present our case. If his terms are acceptable, we will place ourselves under his protection. As the assembly disperses, you find yourself wondering about this Antifi, the local strongman whose power grows as traditional authority wanes. Is he truly the benevolent protector some describe, or simply another warlord exploiting the chaos for his own gain? The historical records you recall suggest a complex figure, boastful of his achievements, but also genuinely concerned with maintaining order and preventing starvation in his territories. Later, as evening approaches, you sit with Senbi's family for a meagre meal of bread and dried fish, proteins carefully rationed in these difficult times. The household is quieter than the previous evening, each person lost in their own thoughts about the village's precarious situation. Will you join the delegation to Antifi? Henetson asks her husband. Senbi nods slowly. Ipua has asked me to go. I've traded in Hieraconpolis before and know the roads. When will you leave? Tomorrow at dawn. The sooner we secure protection, the better. As darkness falls over the village, you help the family prepare for sleep, spreading reed mats and checking that doors and windows are secured. The raid has left everyone on edge, fearful of what the night might bring. Before retiring to your corner of the house, you step outside briefly, gazing up at the stars. They're the same stars that shone over the Egypt of the mighty pharaohs, the same stars that will shine over the eventually reunified Middle Kingdom. But for now, they look down on a fractured land where survival itself has become a daily struggle. This is the reality of Egypt's dark age, not just political fragmentation and environmental challenges, but the human experience of living through the collapse of what had seemed an eternal order. Yet even in this darkness, people adapt, make difficult choices, and find ways to continue. The resilience you've witnessed in just 2 days gives you a new appreciation for how civilizations navigate their darkest hours. As you prepare to sleep, you wonder what tomorrow will bring in this broken but enduring land along the Nile. The journey to seek Antifi's protection represents both the desperation of the times and the pragmatic adaptability that might eventually lead Egypt out of its dark age, though that resolution remains years in the future. For now, in this village caught between fading traditions and harsh new realities, people do what humans have always done in times of crisis. They persist, they adapt, and they hope for better days ahead, whether through the return of proper Nile floods, the emergence of strong new leadership, or simply the stubborn determination to survive. Egypt will eventually find its way back to stability and prosperity. The question is how many villages like this one and how many families like Senbi's will live to see that renewal. Dawn breaks over the village with tentative rays of golden light. Despite yesterday's raid, the rhythms of life continue, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human resilience. You've risen early to help Senbi prepare for his journey to Hieraconpolis, where he and 2 other village representatives will seek the protection of Antifi, the powerful nomarch who controls territories to the south. "Take this," Henderson says, pressing a small clay figurine into her husband's hand. "I had the wise woman make it yesterday. It will provide protection on the road." Senbi examines the crude statuette, a simple human form with distinctive features of the god Bez, the dwarf deity who wards off evil spirits and protects households. In more prosperous times, such amulets would have been crafted by skilled artisans from precious materials. Now, simple clay must suffice, but the belief in its protective power remains strong. "I'll keep it close," Senbi promises, tucking the figurine into the small travel pouch at his waist. This exchange highlights how personal magic has become increasingly important during the First Intermediate period. With the elaborate state religion weakened by political fragmentation, ordinary Egyptians are turning to household deities and magical practices that offer more immediate protection. Bes, with his lion-like face and dwarf body, was particularly popular as a guardian against dangerous forces, especially during travel. You help Senbi gather his few provisions for the journey: a small loaf of bread, dried fish wrapped in linen, a water skin filled from the village well, and a walking stick that might serve as a weapon if needed. The delegation is travelling light, planning to cover the distance to Hieraconpolis in 2 days of steady walking. The roads aren't what they once were, Senbi explains as he checks his sandals for the journey ahead. During the Old Kingdom, royal officials maintained way stations with fresh water and guards to protect travellers. The pharaoh's peace extended throughout the 2 lands. Now, he shrugs, leaving the current reality unspoken. Before the collapse of central authority, Egypt had benefited from relatively safe travel routes along the Nile and through the desert, allowing for trade and communication across vast distances. The breakdown of this infrastructure is yet another symptom of the Dark Age that has engulfed the once mighty civilization. As the sun climbs higher, Senbi joins the other delegates at the village edge. Ipua himself has decided to go, along with a craftsman named Senenut, whose skill at negotiation is well regarded. A small crowd has gathered to see them off, offering hushed blessings and wishes for safe return. "What will you do while I'm gone?" Senbi asks you before departing. You've considered this question through the night and have decided to make yourself useful to the village during this difficult time. With the delegation seeking political protection, the community still needs immediate help with food production and security. "I'll help with the fishing expedition to the Eastern Lake," you tell him. Henderson mentioned the village is organising a group to try their luck there. Senbi nods approvingly. "Good. They'll need strong arms to haul nets and keep watch." The lake was a reliable source of food before the troubles began. Perhaps it will provide again. With final embraces exchanged between Senbi and his family, the delegation departs, heading south along the dusty path that follows the Nile's course. You watch until they disappear around a bend, wondering what reception they'll find in Antifi's territory. Later that morning, you join a group of 7 villagers preparing for the fishing expedition. The mood is determined but anxious. The lake lies several hours' walk from the village, in an area that has become less secure as central authority has diminished. Still, the potential reward of fresh fish to supplement dwindling grain supplies makes the risk worthwhile. The fishing party consists mostly of younger men, though two older fishermen with extensive knowledge of the lake's patterns are providing guidance. You're given a net to carry and a sharpened stick that serves as both walking staff and spear. Stay together and keep your eyes open, instructs Renef, the eldest of the fishermen. His weathered face speaks of decades spent under the Egyptian sun. We'll be passing through territory that no one truly controls now. That means no one's protection applies. As your group sets out, heading east away from the Nile, you can't help but notice how the landscape has changed from what must have been its appearance during more prosperous times. Fields that should be lush with barley and emmer wheat show signs of neglect. Irrigation channels partially collapsed, soil dried and cracked. Occasionally you pass abandoned homesteads, their mud brick walls already returning to the earth from which they were formed. That farm belonged to Khagemni's family for 3 generations, Renef tells you, pointing to a particularly forlorn collection of structures. When the floods failed 2 seasons in a row, they moved north seeking better land, never returned. This pattern of internal migration is another feature of the first intermediate period. As environmental conditions deteriorated in some areas, populations shifted, leading to abandoned settlements in some regions and increased pressure on resources in others. The relatively stable settlement patterns of the Old Kingdom had given way to a more fluid and uncertain geography. As the morning progresses into afternoon, your group maintains a brisk pace, speaking little to conserve energy in the growing heat. The landscape gradually transitions from fields to more marginal land, scrubby vegetation and occasional acacia trees that can survive with minimal water. In the distance, you can make out the shimmer of the lake, though it appears smaller than the descriptions had led you to expect. The lake has shrunk, confirms Renef, noticing your gaze. In my father's time it extended all the way to that far ridge, now it retreats more each year, another sign that Ma'at is disturbed. Upon reaching the lake's edge, you discover that your group is not alone. A family of 5 has established a temporary camp nearby, a simple shelter of reeds and a small fire around which they sit preparing fish. They watch your approach with obvious wariness, the father rising to his feet with a spear clutched defensively. Renef raises his hands to show peaceful intentions. "We come from the village of Hut Herib to fish, nothing more," he calls out. The tension eases somewhat, though the family maintains their distance. "The fishing is poor," the man responds. "We've been here 3 days and barely caught enough to feed ourselves." "You're from downriver?" Renef asks. The man nods. "Our village was raided by soldiers claiming to serve the nomarch of the Edfu Nome. We fled with what we could carry." This encounter illustrates the growing refugee crisis as political violence and resource scarcity drive people from their homes. Displaced families like this one survive on the margins, utilising whatever skills and resources they can access. After brief negotiations, an arrangement is reached. Your group will share some of their bread in exchange for information about the best fishing spots currently. It's a small moment of cooperation in an increasingly fragmented society, a reminder that even in dark times, humans can find ways to work together for mutual benefit. The fishing proceeds through the afternoon, though as warned, the catch is disappointing. The lake's receding waters have concentrated the remaining fish, but overall populations seem to have declined dramatically. Still, by sunset, your nets have captured enough to justify the expedition. Not abundance by any measure, but a welcome addition to the village's food stores. You make camp near the lake for the night, planning to return to the village in the morning. As darkness falls, the family of refugees joins your group around the fire, proximity offering security for all in the uncertain night. The children's initial shyness gives way to curiosity, and soon they're listening intently as Renef shares stories of better days. When I was no taller than this spear, the old fisherman begins, the pharaoh Pepi still ruled from his palace at Memphis. Each year when the Nile rose to bless our fields, royal officials would measure the height of the flood using the Nilometer, a special measuring device with markings to show how high the water reached. This determined how much tax each province would pay. The children listen, wide-eyed, to descriptions of a political and social order that collapsed before they were born. For them, the fragmented Egypt of competing nomarchs and local strongmen is the only reality they've known. Is it true the old pharaohs could speak to the gods? Asks one child. Renef nods solemnly. The pharaoh was no ordinary man. He was Horus in living form, the link between our world and the divine realm. Through proper rituals and offerings, he maintained Mayat for all Egypt. Then why did the gods abandon us? The question comes from the refugee father, his voice carrying a sharp edge of bitterness. An uncomfortable silence falls over the group. It's the question that haunts all of Egypt during this dark age. Why has the cosmic order broken down? Why have the reliable patterns of nature and society seemingly collapsed? In the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's divine connection was believed to ensure prosperity and stability. Now, that certainty has been shattered. Some say it was the length of Pepi's reign, offers one of the younger fishermen eventually. He lived so long that when he finally joined the gods, proper succession had been forgotten. Others say the priests at Memphis failed in their rituals. The royal officials became greedy, suggests another. They kept too much for themselves and neglected proper offerings to the gods. These explanations reflect the Egyptian need to understand their crisis in terms of their worldview, as a disruption of proper religious and political order rather than purely environmental or economic factors. In a society where religion permeated every aspect of life, spiritual explanations for disaster were inevitable. As the fire burns lower and night deepens around your camp, the conversation shifts to more immediate concerns. Which routes are safe for travel, where food might be found, which nomarchs treat their subjects with some measure of fairness. This practical information has become the most valuable currency in uncertain times. Before sleep claims the group, the refugee father brings out a small reed flute and plays a melancholy tune that drifts across the darkened lake. Music, that most resilient expression of human spirit, survives even in the darkest ages. You awaken at first light to find the refugee family already departed, having slipped away in the pre-dawn hours. They left behind a small carved wooden fish, a token of thanks for the shared bread and fire. Such small gestures of kindness and reciprocity persist even as larger social structures collapse. Your group packs the previous day's catch into reed baskets preserved with salt brought for this purpose. Fish was a staple of the Egyptian diet in all periods, but during food shortages like those of the First Intermediate period, its importance only increased. Preserved by drying and salting, fish could provide protein when grain stores ran low. The return journey passes without incident, though everyone remains vigilant. By midday, you reach the village where your arrival with the modest catch is greeted with genuine enthusiasm. In times of scarcity, even small successes are cause for celebration. Henotson welcomes you back to her household, eager for any distraction from worry about her husband's dangerous diplomatic mission. The fish will make an excellent meal, she says, examining your portion of the catch. Perhaps we can trade some for vegetables from Karneferhotep's garden. Her soil still produces well, even with the poor floods. This casual comment highlights another adaptation to the crisis: increased local trade and resource sharing within communities. With long-distance trade networks disrupted by political fragmentation and banditry, villages were turning inward, developing more localized economies based on direct exchange of goods and services. As you help Henotson prepare the fish for preservation, she shares village news from your brief absence. 2 more families have decided to leave, she tells you. They're heading north to the delta, where they have relatives. They say the flooding is more reliable there because the river splits into many branches. This ongoing fragmentation of communities represents another social cost of the first intermediate period. Extended families and village groups that had maintained cohesion for generations were now scattering, seeking survival in different directions. And there's been a visitor, Henotson continues, lowering her voice slightly. A priest from the old temple at Yunu arrived yesterday, travelling south. He performs rituals in exchange for food and shelter. Yunu, you know, was the Egyptian name for the great religious centre the Greeks would later call Hieraconpolis, one of the most important cult centres of Ra, the sun god who had risen to prominence during the Old Kingdom. That a priest from such a prestigious temple was now wandering and performing rituals for food speaks volumes about the deterioration of religious institutions during this period. What kind of rituals, you ask? Mostly protective spells and divinations, Henotson explains. People want to know if the Nile will flood properly this year, if the Nomarch's conflicts will reach our village, if their loved ones who've gone elsewhere are safe. She hesitates, then adds, I gave him a bread loaf to perform a ritual for Senbi's safe return. This increased focus on divination and protective magic is characteristic of societies under stress. With traditional sources of security and certainty undermined, people seek reassurance through supernatural means, trying to pierce the veil of an uncertain future. Later that afternoon, you encounter the priest himself, a thin man of middle years wearing a once fine linen kilt, now showing signs of extensive travel. He sits in the shade of a sycamore tree at the village edge, drawing symbols in the dust with a reed as a small group of villagers watch intently. The waters will rise, he pronounces, studying the patterns he's created, not to the abundance of old times, but better than recent years. Those who can plant when the land first emerges from the flood will harvest enough to survive. His audience receives this prediction with visible relief. In agricultural societies like ancient Egypt, climate predictability was quite literally a matter of life and death. The annual Nile Flood, which had been remarkably consistent for millennia before the first intermediate period, had become erratic, leaving farmers struggling to adapt their planting and harvesting cycles. You join the small crowd, curious about this representative of Egypt's religious establishment. When the divination concludes and people begin to disperse, you approach him directly. You've travelled from Yunu, you ask. The priest studies you with shrewd eyes before responding. Yes, though the temple there is a shadow of what it once was. When the royal offerings ceased, many priests departed. Some of us try to maintain the rituals as best we can, travelling where we're needed. Do you believe the gods have abandoned Egypt? The question escapes before you can consider its boldness. Rather than taking offence, the priest sighs deeply. The gods have not abandoned Egypt. It is Egypt that has abandoned proper worship. When the kingship fractured and the gnomes began fighting amongst themselves, the cosmic balance was disturbed. He gestures toward the western horizon. Ra still crosses the sky in his boat each day. Happy still brings the flood, though less abundantly. The gods remain. It is order among men that has been lost. This perspective reflects the traditional Egyptian understanding of their world, that human political and religious order mirrored cosmic order, each influencing the other. The upheaval in Egyptian society wasn't simply a political or environmental crisis, but a cosmic one. Can order be restored, you ask? The priest's expression turns thoughtful. There are signs. In the south, the nomarchs of Thebes grow stronger, bringing several gnomes under their control. They honour the old ways, making proper offerings to Amun and Montu. In the north, Hieraconpolis maintains some semblance of the ancient traditions. He shrugs slightly. Perhaps from one of these centres, a new unification will emerge. Egypt has endured dark periods before. This conversation offers a glimpse of hope that even in the midst of fragmentation and crisis, the seeds of renewal are being planted. Historical hindsight tells you the priest's cautious optimism is warranted. The Theban nomarchs he mentions will indeed eventually reunify Egypt, establishing the Middle Kingdom and restoring centralized authority, though that resolution remains years in the future from your current moment. As evening approaches, the village gathers for a communal meal where the day's fish catch is shared along with bread and vegetables. Despite shortage, the principle of communal eating remains important, another thread of cultural continuity connecting this troubled time to Egypt's more prosperous past. The conversation around the cooking fires centres on the delegation to Antifi and what terms he might offer for his protection. Opinions are divided, reflecting deeper uncertainties about identity and allegiance in this fragmented era. My grandfather would never have considered pledging loyalty to a no-march from another province, says an older man bitterly. In his day, all respected the pharaoh's authority, from the cataracts to the Great Green Sea. Your grandfather didn't watch his children starve while soldiers took what little grain remained, counters a woman sharply. Antifi keeps order in his territories and ensures food is distributed in times of famine. What does it matter which nome he comes from if he maintains Mawat in his realm? This debate captures a fundamental tension of the first intermediate period between traditional conceptions of political legitimacy based on divine kingship and more pragmatic concerns about security and survival. The old certainties have been shattered, forcing Egyptians to reconsider fundamental aspects of their social and political organization. As you listen to the villagers debate their future, you find yourself reflecting on the remarkable adaptability of human societies even in times of severe stress. The Egypt you've encountered is undeniably in crisis, its political unity shattered, its economic systems disrupted, its religious certainties questioned. Yet people continue to find ways to survive, to maintain some semblance of community, to forge new arrangements in the face of changing realities. Night falls over the village, stars appearing in a sky that has witnessed the rise and fall of Egypt's fortunes across millennia. Tomorrow will bring new challenges in this dark age. Perhaps news from the delegation to Antifi, perhaps another raid, perhaps simply the ongoing struggle to find sufficient food. But tonight, in the flickering light of cooking fires, with the gentle sounds of conversation and occasional laughter rising into the evening air, there are still moments of connection and comfort, even in the shadow of collapse. The resilience you've witnessed gives context to what you know from historical perspective, that Egypt will emerge from this dark age, will reunify and rebuild, will reclaim its place as one of the ancient world's great powers. The path to that renewal is being laid even now, in small decisions and adaptations that might seem insignificant in isolation but collectively chart a course through crisis toward eventual recovery. As you prepare for sleep, you wonder about Senbi and the delegation, now presumably arrived at Hieraconpolis and presenting their case to the powerful Antifi. Their mission represents both the desperation of these times and the pragmatic adaptability that allows societies to navigate even their darkest hours, seeking new protectors when old ones fail, forging new arrangements when traditional structures collapse. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges in this broken but enduring land. For now, sleep offers temporary respite from the harsh realities of Egypt's dark age. As your consciousness fades, the last sound you register is the soft singing of a mother to her child, a lullaby perhaps sung for generations along the Nile, another thread of continuity binding past to present and, eventually, to a more stable future yet to dawn. 3 days have passed since the delegation departed for Hieraconpolis, and the village waits anxiously for news. You've settled into a routine, helping where needed, repairing irrigation channels, assisting with food preparation, joining patrols that watch the surrounding area for potential threats. These daily activities provide structure amid uncertainty, helping to quiet the constant undercurrent of worry that characterizes life in this fragmented time. On the morning of the 4th day, a shout from the village perimeter signals the delegation's return. People emerge from homes and workshops, gathering eagerly as Senbi, Ipua and Senanut walk wearily into the village centre, dust from the road still clinging to their sandals and kilts. The faces of the returning men reveal little, a careful neutrality that suggests complicated news. Ipua raises his hands for silence as the villagers press forward with questions. "We have met with the great Antifi," he announces formally. "We have seen his strength and the prosperity of the territories under his protection. After careful negotiation, he has agreed to extend his shield over our village." A murmur runs through the gathered crowd, relief mingled with uncertainty. Protection means survival in these dangerous times, but it also means new obligations and a shift in loyalties that would have been unthinkable in more stable eras. "What are his terms?" calls a voice from the crowd. Ipua glances at his fellow delegates before responding. 1/5 of our harvest will go to his storehouses as tribute. 6 able men will join his militia when called upon. We will acknowledge him as our rightful ruler in all matters of governance and justice. These terms spark immediate debate. 1/5 is a substantial portion of the village's agricultural output, especially in these years of poor harvests. Yet it's considerably less than what raiders might take by force, and the promise of protection holds real value in an increasingly lawless region. In return, Ipua continues, once the initial reaction has subsided, his soldiers will patrol our boundaries and respond if we are threatened. More importantly, he has promised grain from his storehouses should our harvest fail entirely. No one under his protection has starved, even in the worst years of famine. This last point carries particular weight. Antifi was known historically for his grain distribution programs during times of scarcity, a form of resource management that helped maintain stability in his territories while extending his influence. His tomb inscription famously proclaimed, "I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. The whole country has become like locusts going upstream and downstream in search of food, but I never allowed anyone in need to go from this nome to another one." After the formal announcement, the crowd breaks into smaller groups discussing the implications of this new arrangement. You follow Senbi back to his home, where he slumps onto a reed mat, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "How was Hieraconpolis?" you ask, as Henetson hurries to bring her husband water and food. "Changed," Senbi responds after a long drink. "I traded there regularly before the troubles began. It was a prosperous place, but no more important than many other provincial centres. Now," he shakes his head slightly, "now it's the seat of real power. Antifi has gathered strong men around him, built fortifications and expanded the temple to Horus. He styles himself great overlord of 3 nomes, not merely a local governor." This description aligns with what historical records suggest about Antifi, a regional warlord who combined military might with administrative competence and religious legitimation, creating a power base that transcended traditional nome boundaries during the fragmented First Intermediate period. Is he a just ruler, you ask? Senbi considers this carefully. "He is effective," he says finally. "Justice in these times looks different than in the days of the true pharaohs. His methods can be harsh, but those under his protection fare better than most. We saw fields being cultivated, irrigation works maintained, people with enough food to remain healthy." He lowers his voice slightly, though only family is present. He speaks of the king at Memphis, claims to act in his name, but this is merely a convenient fiction. The real authority is his alone. This practice was common during the First Intermediate Period, local rulers claiming to recognize the nominal authority of a king while exercising independence in practice. It maintained a facade of traditional political order while accommodating the new reality of fragmented power. When will his protection begin? Henderson asks practically. His representatives will arrive within 10 days to formalize the arrangement and collect initial tribute, Senbi explains. He expects this season's harvest to be poor, but demands what he considers a fair portion nonetheless. He positions these contributions as necessary for the common defense, not mere taxation. The news of Antifi's protection spreads quickly through the village, and preparations begin immediately. The most presentable food items are set aside for the upcoming tribute. Damaged sections of the village wall are repaired and homes are tidied, all efforts to make a favourable impression on the nomarchy's representatives. Despite the new arrangement's potential benefits, you sense an undercurrent of unease among the villagers. They've traded independence for protection, a bargain born of necessity rather than choice. More fundamentally, this new allegiance represents another step away from the traditional order that defined Egyptian civilization for millennia, the divine kingship that united the two lands under a single legitimate ruler. The following days bring a flurry of activity as the village prepares for Antifi's representatives. You help with the physical labour of clearing pathways and repairing buildings, but also observe the psychological adjustments taking place as people recalibrate their understanding of political authority and belonging. On the evening before the expected arrival, a simple ritual is held in the village shrine, a small mud brick structure dedicated primarily to Hapi, god of the Nile Flood, though images of other deities are also present. The village priest, an elderly man who received basic training at a provincial temple in more stable times, offers modest sacrifices of bread, beer, and a single duck. "Great Horus of Hieraconpolis," he intones, "mighty protector whose strong arm shelters the righteous, look favourably upon this village as we enter the domain of your servant Antifi. Grant us prosperity under his governance and protection from all who would do us harm." This prayer reflects an important adaptation in religious practice. By invoking Horus of Hieraconpolis specifically, the priest acknowledges the local deity most associated with Antifi's power base. Religious practice during the First Intermediate Period became more localized, with increased emphasis on regional cults rather than the more universal worship centered on the pharaoh that characterized the Old Kingdom. After the formal offerings, villagers place their own smaller contributions before the divine images. Tiny bread loaves, flowers, small cups of beer. These personal devotions represent another shift in religious practice during this period, with individuals taking more direct approaches to the divine, rather than relying solely on the official state religion mediated by the king and professional priesthood. Dawn brings the awaited delegation from Antifi. Unlike the desperate bandits who raided the village days earlier, these men arrive with disciplined formation and purpose. 6 soldiers in leather armour carrying copper-tipped spears, led by a scribe and an official wearing the leopard skin cloak that marks him as having some religious authority. The village council, led by Ipua, meets them formally at the edge of the settlement. You stand with Senbi's household among the gathered onlookers, observing this moment of political transition. The official introduces himself as Harkabi, steward of Antifi's northern territories. He carries a wooden staff of office, its top carved with the falcon head of Horus, a symbol of authority that harkens back to more unified times, while now representing Antifi's regional power. "In the name of the great overlord Antifi, overseer of priests, controller of the 2 southern gnomes and the door of the south, I extend the protection of his strong arm over this village," Harkabi announces in the formal cadence of official proclamations. What follows is a careful accounting of expectations and obligations, the tribute required, the men to be provided for military service when needed, the acknowledgement of Antifi's judicial authority. Each point is recorded by the accompanying scribe on a papyrus scroll. Literacy and administrative record-keeping continuing even in these fragmented times, though now serving regional powers rather than a centralized state. The negotiations proceed with the detailed attention to contractual specifics that characterized Egyptian administrative practice even in periods of political disunity. The amounts of grain, livestock, and goods are precisely specified, with allowances made for poor harvests and provisions for emergency support if needed. The great overlord understands the difficulties of these times, Harkibi states. He does not demand what cannot be provided, but know that his generosity depends upon loyal service. Those who honour their obligations will find protection and support. Those who do not will be taught the cost of disloyalty. The implicit threat behind these words hangs in the air. Antifi, like other regional strongmen of the period, maintained his authority through a combination of protection and intimidation. His tomb inscriptions boast of both his care for those under his governance and his merciless treatment of enemies and oath-breakers. Once the formal agreement is established, the delegation inspects the village thoroughly, assessing fields, counting livestock, examining storehouses. Everything of value is catalogued with administrative precision, establishing a baseline for future tribute collection. You help Senbi present his modest trading goods for assessment, the few items of value he's managed to preserve through the recent difficulties. The scribe records each item methodically, assigning values according to some standardized system that has survived the collapse of central authority. These weights and measures are from Memphis, you observe quietly, noticing the small stone weights the scribe uses to assess some metal items. The old systems remain useful, Senbi responds with a slight shrug. Even in chaos, people need ways to determine fair exchange. The nomarchs may fight amongst themselves, but most maintain the traditional administrative methods. They were effective. This continuity of administrative practice, despite political fragmentation, is an important aspect of how Egyptian civilization maintained cohesion through the Dark Age. The bureaucratic systems developed during the Old Kingdom were sufficiently robust to survive in adapted forms, even as the central authority that created them collapsed. By midday, the assessment is complete and the delegation has collected the initial tribute, modest given the village's straitened circumstances, but symbolically important in establishing the new relationship. Harkibi addresses the assembled villagers one final time before departing. The great overlord Antifi says, "I am the beginning and end of mankind. Since no one like me existed before, nor will he exist, I have done what my predecessors left undone, and my successors will not approach my deeds in the millions of years to come." These bombastic claims, drawn directly from actual inscriptions in Antifi's tomb, demonstrate how regional rulers during the first intermediate period adopted the grandiose language once reserved for pharaohs. In the absence of a strong central monarchy, local strongmen appropriated royal literary styles and symbolic expressions to legitimize their authority. 2 soldiers will remain to establish a watching post, Harkibi concludes. Should danger threaten, they will send word, and the great overlord's forces will respond. You now stand under his mighty protection. As the main delegation departs, taking the collected tribute, the village absorbs this new reality. The 2 remaining soldiers, stern-faced men with the weathered look of experienced fighters, establish themselves in a corner of the headman's compound, creating a small outpost of Antifi's authority within the village. That evening, a modest feast celebrates the new arrangement. Despite the tribute paid, there's a sense of relief among many villagers, the promise of protection worth the cost in resources and autonomy. Musicians play simple reed flutes and drums, creating a moment of joy amidst the ongoing hardships. As you share a cup of beer with Senbi's family, the merchant reflects on the day's events. "My father would not have believed it," he says quietly. In his time, the pharaoh's word was law throughout the two lands. Local governors were appointed by the king and served at his pleasure. Now we pledge loyalty to a nomarch who speaks of some distant king but rules by his own strength alone. Is it so different in practice, you ask? The pharaoh collected taxes and provided protection through his officials. Antifi demands tribute and offers security. The difference is in Ma'at, Senbi replies. The proper order. The pharaoh was divine, the living Horus who maintained cosmic balance through proper rule and ritual. These nomarchs are merely men, powerful but not divine. Without the true king maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual, how can Egypt be whole? This philosophical question cuts to the heart of the Egyptian worldview, disrupted by the first intermediate period. The pharaoh wasn't merely a political ruler, but a cosmic linchpin whose proper ritual actions maintained the order of the universe itself. The fragmentation of political authority thus represented not just an administrative problem, but a metaphysical crisis. Later that night, as most of the village sleeps, you join Senbi for a moment of quiet conversation under the stars. The celebrations have ended, and the reality of the new arrangement is settling in. What happens now, you ask? "We survive," he answers simply. "We pay Antifi's tribute, accept his protection, and hope the Nile floods sufficiently this year. We continue as best we can until order is restored to the two lands." "Do you believe it will be? Restored, I mean." Senbi gazes upward at the unchanging stars, so constant above Egypt's shifting fortunes. "It must be," he says finally. "Egypt has endured for 1,000 years. The gods cannot permit chaos to reign forever. Someone will arise to reunite the two lands. Perhaps from Thebes, perhaps from Hieraconpolis, but unity will return." His confidence, however measured, feels rooted in something deeper than mere optimism, a fundamental belief in the eventual restoration of proper order that sustained Egyptian civilization through its darkest hours. The following days establish new patterns under Antifi's distant authority. The two stationed soldiers mostly observe rather than interfere in village affairs, though their presence serves as a constant reminder of the new power relationship. One unexpected benefit emerges quickly. Travelling merchants, learning of Antifi's protection, begin to include the village in their routes again. A trader arrives with copper tools to exchange for local goods, bringing not just valuable implements but news from more distant regions. The nomarch of Thebes grows stronger, he tells interested listeners as transactions proceed. Intef now controls territories from Coptos to Elephantine. They say he no longer acknowledges even the pretense of Memphis's authority, but has taken on royal titles for himself. This news causes considerable discussion. The balance of power between competing centres, particularly Thebes in the south and Hieraconpolis in the north, would ultimately determine Egypt's political future. Those with historical knowledge know that it will eventually be the Theban rulers who reunify the country, establishing the Middle Kingdom, but in this moment the outcome remains uncertain. "And what of Hieraconpolis?" asks someone in the crowd. "Do they still claim kingship over all Egypt?" Their power remains strong in the north, the trader confirms, but they struggle with incursions from Asiatics at the eastern borders. Some say the foreigners settle in increasing numbers in the delta, bringing strange customs and gods. This reference to foreign settlement in the northeastern delta reflects another consequence of the weakened central authority. Egypt's borders had become more permeable, allowing groups from the Levant to establish communities in Egyptian territory. These Asiatics, as Egyptians called their eastern neighbours, would become increasingly significant, eventually leading to the Hyksos period of foreign rule centuries later. As life settles into new rhythms under Antifi's protection, you notice subtle changes in the village's spiritual practices. The official religion centred on major deities and the divine kingship hasn't disappeared, but alongside it, household magic and protective rituals have become more prominent. One evening, you observe Henotson carefully placing a small clay figurine beneath the threshold of their home. The crude statue represents Bes, the dwarf deity who protected households, particularly from dangerous forces that might enter during the night. "My grandmother taught me this placement is most effective," she explains, noticing your interest. "Bes guards the transition between outside and inside, keeping harmful spirits at bay. This increased emphasis on protective household deities and magic represents another adaptation to the uncertain times." With the state religion weakened by political fragmentation, ordinary Egyptians turned increasingly to personal magical practices and local gods who seemed more immediately responsive to their needs. The two soldiers stationed by Antifi become an accepted part of village life. Initially viewed with suspicion, they gradually integrate into daily routines. One, named Paheri, even shares knowledge of improved bow-making techniques he learned in military service, helping the village hunters create more effective weapons. Antifi maintains the largest contingent of archers in Upper Egypt, Paheri explains as he demonstrates proper bow construction. His men train regularly and are well supplied. This is why raiders fear his territories. This military advantage helps explain Antifi's success as a regional power during the fragmented First Intermediate period. Well-organised armed forces allowed him to extend his control beyond traditional nome boundaries and offer meaningful protection to communities under his authority. A week after the delegation's visit, the first test of this protection comes when lookouts spot a group of armed men approaching from the north, a band of perhaps 15 individuals with the disorganized appearance of bandits rather than soldiers. When word reaches the village, Paheri and his companion immediately take charge, organising the village men into defensive positions while sending a young boy running south to bring reinforcements. "Display Antifi's standard," Paheri commands, producing a simple wooden emblem painted with distinctive markings that identify the village as under official protection. The approaching group slows upon seeing the standard raised above the village walls. After visible discussion among themselves, they change direction, bypassing the village entirely. The threatened raid dissolves without a single arrow fired, the reputation of Antifi's strength proving sufficient deterrent. "This is why we pay tribute," Senbi observes as the potential threat recedes. "Better grain in Antifi's storehouses than blood on our walls." This incident reinforces the pragmatic bargain the village has struck, sacrificing some resources and autonomy for security in an increasingly dangerous world. It's an arrangement born of necessity rather than preference, but in the harsh realities of Egypt's dark age, such compromises have become essential for survival. As another week passes, a more ambiguous development emerges. The stationed soldiers begin conducting a census of young men in the village, evaluating their fitness for military service. This goes beyond the agreed terms, which specified men would be provided only when specifically requested. "The Great Overlord expands his territories," explains Paheri when questioned by the village council. He requires additional forces to secure new lands and respond to threats from Thebes. This mission creep in Antifi's demands reflects the reality of regional powers during the First Intermediate period, their authority often expanding opportunistically when not checked by countervailing forces. What begins as protection can gradually transform into more direct control with increasingly burdensome obligations. Ipua negotiates carefully, neither directly refusing the expanded recruitment nor fully acceding to it. We will present suitable candidates when formal request is made through proper channels, he tells Paheri diplomatically, as specified in our agreement with the Great Overlord. This delicate resistance reflects how local communities maintained some agency, even while under the authority of regional warlords. The relationship was not simply one of dominance and submission, but a negotiated arrangement that required ongoing management from both sides. As the month's end approaches, anticipation builds for the annual Nile Flood, that crucial inundation that will determine the village's fate more surely than any political arrangement. Rituals to happy increase, with daily offerings and prayers for a generous but controlled rise of the life-giving waters. The flood has been weak for 3 successive years, explains the village priest to newer residents. If it fails again this season, even Antifi's storehouses may not have sufficient grain to prevent widespread famine. This environmental uncertainty formed the backdrop to all political and social developments during the first intermediate period. Climate change affecting Nile flood patterns had undermined the agricultural abundance that supported Egyptian civilization, creating resource scarcity that exacerbated political fragmentation. Standing at the river's edge one evening, you watch the water with villagers anxiously looking for any sign of the coming inundation. The Nile flows calmly, giving no indication of the dramatic rise that must come if crops are to grow in the coming season. An older farmer named Nakt stands beside you, his eyes fixed on the river that has dictated the rhythms of Egyptian life for millennia. I remember floods that rose to the 3rd marking on the Nilometer, he says wistfully. The fields were so rich afterward that the grain grew taller than a man. Now we pray for half that height, and often receive less. Whether from climate change, reduced rainfall in Ethiopia where the Blue Nile originates, or some combination of factors, the reduced flooding had direct consequences for Egyptian society. Agricultural output declined, undermining the economic foundation of the centralized state, and contributing to the political fragmentation that defines this dark age. As you continue your vigil by the river, Nakt suddenly straightens, pointing to something in the water. Look there, floating reeds from upriver, and the water has a different colour. See? More sediment. It begins. Other villagers notice the same subtle signs, and word spreads quickly. The annual flood is coming. Whether it will be sufficient remains to be seen, but the mere fact of its arrival brings hope after months of uncertainty. That night, the village holds an impromptu celebration, offering thanks to Hapi and the other gods who control the life-giving waters. Musicians play, bread and beer are shared, and for a few hours the hardships of Egypt's dark age recede before this reminder of natural cycles that continue despite human political turmoil. You join in the modest festivities, struck by the resilience of these people who find cause for joy even amid ongoing crisis. Their celebration honours not just the coming flood, but the continuity it represents, a connection to countless generations who have witnessed this same miracle along the Nile's banks. As the celebration continues into the night, a messenger arrives from the south, seeking Paheri with urgent news. The soldier reads the message quickly, his expression growing serious before he hurries to find his companion. The festive mood dims as people notice the soldier's rapid consultation and obvious concern. Something has happened, something significant enough to interrupt even this most important annual celebration. Ipua approaches the soldiers, seeking information, then returns to address the increasingly anxious villagers. Word has come from Hieraconpolis, he announces, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. Forces from Thebes have crossed into territories claimed by Antifi. Battle appears imminent. This news lands heavily on the celebration. The conflict between regional powers that had seemed distant now threatens to directly impact the village's newly established security. If Antifi is defeated, what becomes of his promises of protection? If he prevails but requires more resources for the conflict, will his demands on subject villages increase? As the implications sink in, the celebration gradually resumes, though with a more subdued tone. The coming of the flood remains worthy of gratitude. But this reminder of larger political conflicts tempers the joy with renewed uncertainty. You find yourself wondering, as you watch worried conversations replace celebratory dancing, what this escalation means for the village's future. The messenger mentioned Thebes, the power that historical knowledge tells you will eventually reunify Egypt, ending the first intermediate period and establishing the Middle Kingdom. Are you witnessing the beginning of that process, or simply another inconclusive conflict in a fragmented landscape? These questions remain unanswered as the night deepens. The Nile continues its eternal flow, beginning its life-giving rise toward floodplain fields, while human conflicts play out along its banks. In this moment of overlapping hope and anxiety, natural cycles and human disruption, the complex reality of Egypt's Dark Age is perfectly encapsulated, a civilization in crisis, yet maintaining the cultural continuity and resilience that will eventually enable its renewal. The news of imminent conflict between Antifi and Theban forces spreads through the village like wildfire, dampening the celebration of the coming flood. By morning, Paheri and his fellow soldier have departed south, summoned to join Antifi's main army. Their hasty exit leaves the village in an ambiguous position, still nominally under the No March's protection, but without the visible representation of his authority. What happens if Antifi falls? Asks a worried voice during the village council meeting called to address this new development. The question hangs in the air, giving shape to fears no one had wanted to articulate. We adapt, Ipua responds simply, as we have adapted before. This pragmatic approach reflects how communities navigated the shifting political landscape of the first intermediate period. Survival depended on flexibility, on reading changing power dynamics and adjusting allegiances accordingly. Principle and tradition mattered less than practical outcomes in a world where traditional structures had collapsed. In the days that follow, the Nile continues its gradual rise, the water level climbing steadily up the banks. This natural constant provides reassurance amid political uncertainty. Whatever conflicts rage between human powers, the river follows its ancient rhythms, bringing the silt and water upon which all life in Egypt depends. You help Senbi's household prepare fields for the eventual planting, clearing irrigation channels and repairing water-lifting devices, the shadoofs that will help distribute floodwater efficiently. These practical tasks offer distraction from the ominous news from the south, though conversations inevitably circle back to speculation about the conflict's outcome. If Antifi defeats the Thebans, his power will grow even greater, Senbi observes as you work together on his small plot of land. His demands may increase accordingly. And if Thebes prevails, you ask? Senbi shrugs slightly. Then perhaps we will pay tribute to Intef instead. The nomarchs rise and fall, but the peasant still works the field, the craftsman still makes pots, the scribe still counts the grain. This perspective captures an essential truth about life during political fragmentation. For ordinary people, the specific power-holding authority often mattered less than the general conditions they created. Peace, predictable taxation, protection from raiders, and support during famine were the practical concerns that defined good governance, regardless of who claimed legitimate rule. A week passes with no definitive news from the south, though rumours abound. Some travellers claim Antifi has crushed the Theban forces at the border, others that Intef's army has pushed deep into Antifi's territory. Without official messengers or the established communication networks of more stable times, accurate information travels slowly and unreliably. The Nile continues to rise, reaching what the older farmers judge to be about 2/3 of an ideal flood height. Not the abundance of legendary years, but sufficient to ensure some harvest if properly managed. The practical work of preparing for planting continues alongside anxious monitoring of both the river and the political situation. On the 10th day after the soldiers' departure, a small group of travellers arrives from the south, seeking shelter in the village. They are civilians fleeing the conflict zone, mostly women, children, and the elderly, carrying what few possessions they could manage. The village council meets to consider their request. They come from territories loyal to Antifi, reports Senanut after speaking with them. Their village was caught between the opposing forces. Both sides demanded support and threatened punishment for aiding the enemy. An impossible position, Ipua acknowledges. What choice did they have but to flee? This dilemma, trapped between competing powers each demanding exclusive loyalty, was common for communities in contested regions during the first intermediate period. Without clear authority or established boundaries, local populations often suffered regardless of which side they supported. The council debates briefly before agreeing to shelter the refugees. Though resources are already stretched thin, space is found in various households, with Senbi taking in an elderly couple and their granddaughter. The new arrivals bring first-hand accounts of the conflict, though these too contain contradictions and uncertainties. Antifi's forces held the high ground near the shrine of Horus, explains the elderly man, Uzahet, as he shares Senbi's simple evening meal. They have more archers than the disciplined soldiers, but the Thebans have greater numbers and fighting spirit. Their leader, Intef, claims divine favour, adds his wife, Nefertari. He wears the white crown openly now, styling himself as rightful ruler of Upper Egypt. This detail catches your attention. The white crown was the traditional symbol of kingship in Upper Egypt, worn by pharaohs as one half of the double crown that represented rule over the united two lands. For a nomarch to adopt this royal insignia represented a significant escalation from regional authority to a claim of legitimate kingship. "Does he perform the royal rituals?" asks the village priest, who has joined the conversation with evident interest. "Does he make proper offerings to maintain Mayat?" They say he has expanded the temple of Montu at Thebes, Nefertari responds. The war god receives rich offerings before each campaign. This focus on Montu, the falcon-headed god of war, rather than Amun, who would later become Thebes' principal deity, reflects the militaristic priorities of the early Theban rulers as they sought to expand their territory. Religion served practical political ends, with particular deities emphasized according to immediate needs. The following day brings more refugees and with them more detailed news of the conflict. The picture that emerges is of a significant battle fought to a costly stalemate, with both Antifi and the Theban forces withdrawing to regroup. The boundary between their territories remains contested, with villages caught in between suffering the worst consequences. "This isn't the end," predicts Uzahet grimly. "The Theban nomarch grows stronger each year. They say he seeks to restore Upper Egypt to a single kingdom under his rule, as in the days before the Troubles began." This ambition aligns with what historical hindsight reveals about the Theban dynasty that eventually reunified Egypt. Beginning with the nomarch Intef Y and continuing through his successors, the rulers of Thebes gradually extended their control northward, ultimately defeating their Heracleopolitan rivals and establishing the Middle Kingdom under Mentuhotep II. As more days pass, the village settles into an uneasy routine, absorbing the refugees while continuing preparations for the eventual recession of the flood and the crucial planting season to follow. Without Antifi's soldiers present, the council organises its own patrol rotation, with able men taking turns watching for potential threats. The flood reaches its peak, a modest but adequate inundation that covers most of the cultivable land surrounding the village. Once again, natural cycles provide a counterpoint to human conflicts, a reminder of continuities that transcend political disruptions. For a brief period, the rising waters even offer protection, making the village less accessible to potential raiders. One evening, as you help Senbi's family prepare the evening meal, a commotion at the village perimeter draws everyone's attention. A single figure approaches, a man in military garb, moving with obvious injury or exhaustion. As he draws closer, villagers recognize Paheri, one of Antifi's soldiers previously stationed in the village. He's brought to the headman's compound, given water and food, while the council gathers to hear his news. You join the crowd of anxious listeners as Paheri, recovering his strength, delivers his report. Antifi lives, but his forces have suffered a significant defeat, he begins without preamble. The Thebans employed new tactics, chariots carrying archers who could strike and withdraw before our infantry could engage them effectively. This mention of chariots is historically noteworthy. Though not yet the sophisticated war machines of the New Kingdom, early forms of horse-drawn vehicles were beginning to appear in Egypt during the late First Intermediate period, representing a significant military innovation. Antifi has withdrawn to Hieraconpolis to rebuild his forces, Paheri continues, but his control of the northern territories, he gestures to indicate the region including the village, can no longer be guaranteed. The Theban Advance continues. This news lands heavily on the assembled villagers. Once again, the political landscape has shifted, leaving them in a precarious position, nominally under Antifi's protection, but potentially soon within territory controlled by his rival. What would you advise? Ipuver asks directly. Paheri considers before answering. I cannot speak for the Great Overlord, but as a practical matter, villages in the path of the Theban Advance face three choices: resist and likely be destroyed, flee before the approaching forces, or prepare to acknowledge Intef's authority when his representatives arrive. The soldiers' frank assessment triggers intense discussion among the council and villagers. Some advocate immediate preparation to welcome the Theban forces, arguing that early submission might result in more favourable treatment. Others counsel waiting to see if Antifi can rally and counter the Theban advance. A few suggest abandoning the village entirely, joining the growing stream of refugees seeking safety in more stable regions. The debate continues through the night, reflecting the impossible calculations communities faced during such power transitions. Historical records rarely capture these local deliberations, focusing instead on the grand movements of armies and rulers, but such moments of collective decision-making were crucial to how ordinary Egyptians navigated their dark age. By morning, the council reaches a measured decision. They will neither openly embrace the Theban advance, nor actively resist it. They will continue normal activities, maintain what defences they can, and be prepared to negotiate with whoever arrives claiming authority. We have fields to plant when the waters recede, Ipua reminds the gathered villagers. Without a harvest, it matters little which nomarch claims our allegiance. Surviving this season remains our priority. This practical focus on immediate survival over political allegiance characterized how many communities weathered the First Intermediate period. While elites might engage in ideological battles over legitimate succession and divine right, ordinary Egyptians concerned themselves primarily with securing their next meal. In the weeks that follow, the floodwaters gradually recede, leaving behind the fertile silt that will nourish the coming crops. The timing of planting becomes the village's central preoccupation, temporarily overshadowing even concerns about approaching Theban forces. Fields must be sown at precisely the right moment, when soil remains moist but is no longer waterlogged. You join in this essential labour, working alongside Senbi and other villagers to plant barley and emmer wheat, the staple grains of ancient Egypt. The physical work connects you to countless generations who have performed these same actions along the Nile's banks, a thread of continuity running through even the most disrupted periods of Egyptian history. As planting nears completion, sentries report a substantial force approaching from the south. Not raiders or bandits, but an organised military contingent with the distinctive standards of Thebes prominently displayed. The village council gathers hastily to prepare for the encounter. "We must appear neither too eager nor resistant," advises Senenut. "Show respect but not subservience. They will respect strength even as they demand submission." Ipua nods agreement. "We present ourselves as practical people seeking stability, willing to acknowledge authority that provides genuine protection." This calculated approach to navigating power transitions reflects the political sophistication that communities developed during the fragmented First Intermediate period. Survival often depended on reading power dynamics accurately and positioning oneself advantageously within changing political landscapes. The Theban contingent arrives by mid-afternoon, 30 soldiers led by a military commander and a civil administrator, all bearing the symbols of Intef's authority. The village receives them formally at the central gathering space, with the council presented as legitimate community representatives. The Theban commander, who introduces himself as Mentuhotep, a name that would later be taken by the pharaoh who completes Egypt's reunification, addresses the assembled villagers with directness. The nomarch Intef, who wears the white crown as rightful ruler of Upper Egypt, extends his protection over this region, he announces. Those who acknowledge his authority and provide appropriate tribute will prosper under his governance. Those who resist or maintain loyalty to defeated rivals will face consequences. The language echoes what you heard from Antifi's representatives not long before, the same essential bargain of protection in exchange for resources and loyalty, though now offered by a different power. The political actors change, but the fundamental relationship between rulers and ruled remains consistent. Ipua responds with careful diplomacy, neither rushing to embrace the new authority nor showing defiance. "Our village seeks only to cultivate our fields in peace, to honour the gods with proper offerings, and to live under the protection of rightful governance. We have planted our crops and will offer appropriate tribute from the harvest." What follows is a negotiation similar to the one conducted with Antifi's representatives, though the terms now favour the ascendant Theban power. The tribute demanded is higher, reflecting both the village's status as newly incorporated territory and the Theban rulers' need for resources to continue their military campaigns. The divine Intef rebuilds proper order throughout the land, explains the civil administrator as the terms are recorded. This requires resources. Your contribution supports the restoration of Mayat to all Egypt. This framing, connecting local tribute to cosmic restoration, represents how the Theban rulers legitimized their expansion. They positioned themselves not merely as another competing power, but as restorers of the proper order that had been lost with the old kingdom's collapse. This religious and ideological dimension distinguished their project from the more straightforward regional control exercised by warlords like Antifi. Before departing, the Theban delegation establishes a more substantial presence than Antifi had maintained. 4 soldiers to remain permanently, a small administrative outpost to be constructed, and regular visits by officials to collect tribute and maintain records. This greater administrative integration foreshadows the more centralized governance that would characterize the coming Middle Kingdom. As the main contingent departs, the village absorbs yet another political transition. Some view the Theban authority with hope, seeing in their ambitious claims of legitimate kingship the possibility of a return to the stability of united Egypt. Others see merely another regional power making grand pronouncements while extracting resources from communities with little choice but to comply. Meet the new ruler, same as the old ruler, Senbi comments wryly that evening. Though these Thebans have grander ambitions and more elaborate justifications for taking our grain. Yet even his cynicism is tempered by cautious hope. Still, if someone must rule, better a power that seeks to restore order throughout the two lands than one content merely to control their corner of a fractured Egypt. This sentiment, a yearning for reunification and restored stability after generations of fragmentation, helps explain how the Theban rulers eventually garnered sufficient support to rebuild a united Egyptian state. They offered not just protection, but a vision of restored cosmic order that resonated with a population weary of chaos. The months that follow bring gradual changes as Theban influence solidifies. Administrative practices become more formal, with written records maintained more consistently. The temple receives greater attention, with official support for rituals that had previously depended on local resources alone. Trade increases as routes become more secure under expanding Theban control. These developments offer a glimpse of the transition from the fragmented First Intermediate period toward the more centralized Middle Kingdom. The process was gradual rather than sudden, with administrative practices and religious institutions rebuilt incrementally as Theban authority expanded northward. By the time the harvest arrives, modest but sufficient thanks to the adequate flood, news from the broader region confirms the Theban ascendancy. Antifi's power has been broken, with Hieraconpolis now acknowledging Intef's authority. The boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt has shifted northward, with Theban influence extending well beyond traditional boundaries. They say Intef now styles himself not merely as nomarch or even king of Upper Egypt, but as son of Ra. Intef, reports a travelling merchant visiting the village. He performs royal rituals at Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, claiming the mantle of true kingship. This adoption of full royal titulature and ritual represents another step in the Theban progression from regional power to claimants of legitimate pharaonic authority. By performing ceremonies at Abydos associated with Osiris and ancient kingship, the Theban rulers connected themselves to Egypt's royal traditions, positioning their rise as restoration rather than usurpation. As autumn deepens, bringing cooler days along the Nile, you find yourself reflecting on the tremendous changes you've witnessed in relatively short time. From the desperate uncertainty of a village caught in the chaotic aftermath of central collapse to the emerging stability under expanding Theban control. One evening, sitting with Senbi's family and their refugee guests, who have now become almost permanent residents, the conversation turns to the future. The elderly user Het, who has seen more political transitions than most, offers his perspective. "I've witnessed 3 different powers claim authority over my lifetime," he says, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Each proclaimed themselves the rightful ruler. Each demanded tribute. Each promised protection and prosperity. What makes these Thebans different, I wonder? They rebuild rather than merely control, suggests Senbi. The administrative outpost, the support for the temple, the efforts to secure trade routes, these go beyond extracting resources. They seek to restore institutions. This observation captures an essential difference between mere warlordism and state rebuilding. The Theban project, which would eventually culminate in the Middle Kingdom's establishment, involved reconstructing governance systems and religious institutions, not simply establishing military dominance. "I remember stories my grandfather told," says Nefertari, Userhet's wife, "of the old kingdom before its fall, when the divine pharaoh ruled from Memphis, when massive stones were raised to build the great pyramids, when the Nile flooded abundantly each year. Could such times return?" Her question hangs in the air, a hope that has sustained many through the Dark Age. The historical knowledge you carry tells you that yes, Egypt will rise again, though never precisely as it was. The Middle Kingdom that emerges from the First Intermediate Period will restore central authority and prosperity, but with important differences from the Old Kingdom, it succeeds. You look around at these people who have endured so much: political fragmentation, environmental challenges, raiding, resource scarcity, constant uncertainty, yet maintained essential elements of Egyptian culture and identity throughout. Their resilience has ensured that when stability returns, it will be recognizably Egyptian, building on traditions and practices that survived the Dark Age, rather than emerging as something entirely new. As the conversation continues into the night, your thoughts turn to the broader patterns of history. Civilizations rise and fall, experience golden ages and dark periods, fragment and reunify. Yet through these cycles, cultural continuities persist, carried forward by ordinary people continuing their daily practices even when grand political structures collapse. The Egyptian Dark Age you've experienced represents not a complete break with the past, but a period of adaptation and transformation. The administrative practices, religious concepts, artistic styles, and social structures that defined Egyptian civilization continued, though often in altered forms, suited to changed circumstances. When reunification eventually comes under Mentuhotep II, it builds upon these continuing traditions rather than creating wholly new ones. This perspective offers a profound lesson about human societies, their remarkable capacity for both dramatic change and fundamental continuity, even in their darkest hours when traditional structures seem to have collapsed entirely. The essential elements of cultural identity often endure, preserved through daily practices and beliefs that outlast political configurations. As the evening draws to a close, you join the household in a simple offering to the household gods: a small bread loaf, a cup of beer, a brief prayer for protection through the night. This modest ritual connects the participants to countless generations of Egyptians who have performed similar devotions, a thread of continuity running through prosperous and difficult times alike. Later, lying on your reed mat in the quiet darkness, you reflect on all you've learned about survival during civilization's darkest hours. The First Intermediate Period tested Egyptians in unprecedented ways, environmentally, politically, economically, spiritually. Those who survived did so through flexibility, practical focus on immediate needs, willingness to adapt traditional practices to changed circumstances, and maintenance of community bonds that provided mutual support. These lessons transcend their specific historical context. All human societies face periods of disruption and uncertainty, times when established structures falter and the future seems frighteningly unclear. The Egyptian experience demonstrates how people navigate such challenges, not by rigid adherence to faltering systems nor by abandoning all tradition, but by pragmatic adaptation that preserves essential cultural elements while acknowledging changed realities. As sleep approaches, your last thoughts are of the village and its people, Senbi's family, the council members, the refugees, the farmers and craftspeople, all playing their parts in this story of survival and gradual renewal. Their names might never appear in grand historical narratives focused on kings and battles, but their daily choices and adaptations shaped Egypt's journey through its dark age toward eventual renaissance. The rhythmic sound of gentle breathing from the sleeping household around you merges with the distant murmur of the Nile, creating a soothing backdrop as consciousness fades. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges in this continuing story of survival and adaptation, but for now, sleep offers respite while the eternal river continues its flow, connecting past to present and eventually to a more stable future yet to dawn. Egypt's Dark Age, like all historical periods, eventually passed. The Theban rulers continued their northward expansion until Mentuhotep II finally defeated the Heracleopolitan kingdom around 2055 BCE, reunifying Egypt and establishing the Middle Kingdom. Administrative systems were rebuilt, monumental construction resumed, literature flourished, and trade expanded. The hard-won lessons of the Dark Age, resource management, administrative flexibility, military vigilance, informed the structures of the reunified state, creating a monarchy more responsive to local conditions than its old kingdom predecessor had been. Yet even in more stable times, Egyptians remembered their Dark Age. Literary works from the Middle Kingdom frequently reference the First Intermediate Period as a cautionary tale of what happens when proper order breaks down. The instructions for Merikari, the prophecy of Neferti, and other texts portrayed the period as a time of chaos from which Egypt had been rescued by wise leadership and divine favour. This cultural memory served important purposes, legitimizing the ruling dynasty by positioning them as restorers of order, encouraging loyalty to central authority by highlighting the alternative, and reinforcing religious and social norms by connecting them to stability and prosperity. The Dark Age thus continued to shape Egyptian civilization long after its actual conclusion. In this, perhaps, lies the deepest lesson of Egypt's First Intermediate Period, that difficult times navigated with sufficient resilience and adaptability can eventually give way to renewal, with the hard-earned wisdom of crisis incorporated into more sustainable new structures. The darkness doesn't last forever, and those who endure its challenges may help build something stronger from the experience. This cyclical pattern of breakdown and renewal, crisis and adaptation, darkness and eventual dawn offers a final gentle thought as sleep overtakes you entirely. Even in our most challenging moments, the seeds of future restoration are being planted. If we, like those resilient Egyptians of 4,000 years ago, can maintain what matters most while adapting to what cannot be changed,